Okay, this is the second review PowerPoint, the one for World War II. At the beginning of World War II, the United States was neutral. We had been neutral in the 1920s and the 1930s. Cast your mind back to World War I. We did not join the League of Nations. The term that we used to describe this is isolationism. We wanted to be on our own. We didn't want to get involved in anything. That became harder and harder to do in the 1930s because of the actions of certain countries. Japan invaded Manchuria, a part of China, in 1931. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. There was a civil war in Spain from 1936 to 1939. And of course the big threat was the German threat in the 1930s. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but in the 1930s, Germany became more and more aggressive. Hitler did things that were against the rules, according to the Versailles Treaty. Britain and France really didn't stand up to Hitler. They appeased Hitler. That means they gave in to his demands. By 1939, Germany had invaded Austria and annexed it. That's called the Anschluss. And by 1939, Germany was threatening to invade Poland. Britain and France said, no, if you invade Poland, we will go to war with you. The US had basically passed several laws that were trying to make sure that they would stay out of any world war that began in Europe. And these two acts, the Neutrality Acts of 1935 and 1936, basically said that the United States could not sell weapons to countries that were at war. And this had been done because a lot of people believed that we had only entered World War I because we'd been selling weapons to both sides. And Germany, if you remember, in World War I had been attacking our ships with submarines. In 1939, World War II broke out in Europe as Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France are going to defend Poland. Remember that at this point, the United States is not involved in the war. If you look at the map, though, by 1941, Germany has taken over pretty much all of Europe. Okay? So, what happens is the United States passes new laws to try and help European countries. The first one is destroyers for bases in 1940. And that is where we give Great Britain several ships in return for military bases in the Pacific. And the second one is the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, and you can see I had the wrong date there. So the Lend-Lease Act is 1941. That is where we lend weapons to Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union to fight against Germany. FDR said this was like lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. A lot of Americans wanted to stay out of the war, but FDR was trying to say, look, if we don't do something, there's a danger that the fire, i.e. the war in Europe, could spread and hurt us. By lending a hose to a neighbor, you're not putting yourself in danger. You're giving your neighbor the tools to put out the fire. So by lending or leasing military weapons to European countries, we were giving them the tools to defeat Hitler. And you can see that we gave a lot of money, especially to the British. We give, by the end of World War II, we've given $30 billion worth of stuff to the British, $10 billion worth of stuff to the Soviet Union. Japan brutally invaded China in 1937. You see the areas in red were the Japanese Empire in 1930. 1931 to 1933, Japan had taken over Manchuria. And then from 1937 to 1939, Japan had invaded this area of China. The US stopped trading with Japan. in the late 1930s because we didn't want to sell them things like steel and oil because they could make planes and use the oil for gasoline to power their planes and make military equipment that they could use to attack other countries. We were negotiating with Japan. Tensions had risen, and then without warning, they took us by surprise and attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. FDR called this a date that will live in infamy, and the US declared war on December 8th. And you can see this graphic shows ships and things that were damaged or destroyed at Pearl Harbor. And there's a little graphic with from your book with information about the Pearl Harbor attack. Alright, strategies. The Allied strategy was to focus on Europe, and it was called Defeat Hitler First. In the Pacific, the strategy of the United States was island hopping, and you can see the green arrows. Now let's first talk about Japan's strategy. Japan's strategy was to try and take over as much as they could in the Pacific. And what they were hoping to do was to take over as much territory as possible in the Pacific, and they hoped that this would encourage the United States to just give up, because their task to take back all this stuff would just be too big. The Americans, of course, stood up to the Japanese, and what they did was something called island hopping. They weren't going to take over every single island in the Pacific that the Japanese had taken over. What they were going to do is take over strategic islands and get closer and closer to Japan until finally, in 1945, we're close enough that we can attack Japan. The German strategy is to defeat the Soviet Union, gain control of oil fields in the southern part of the Soviet Union, and bomb Britain, and this is the Battle of Britain in 1940, bomb Britain and attack them with submarines and get them out of the war. And the Germans were hoping to be able to defeat the Soviet Union quickly and the British quickly before the United States could come in and really change things. Some of the key battles in Europe, there are three that you need to know. The first one is El Alamein. This is a battle in North Africa where the Germans were defeated. The Germans had taken over a lot of Europe, and they'd taken over some of North Africa, and they were trying to get to the Middle East. Obviously in the Middle East then, like today, there's lots of oil, and the Germans knew if they could get to that oil, they could keep fighting. The Americans and the British stopped them at El Alamein, and this was kind of a turning point in North Africa. It prevented Germany from getting to the Middle East. In Stalingrad, we have a similar thing. This is the turning point in Eastern Europe, with the Germans trying to get to southern Russia over here, where southern Russia has lots of oil. So this is a big, big turning point, and it allows the Allies to turn the Germans back in Eastern Europe. The D-Day landings are over here. This is in 1944, in June of 1944, and this begins the liberation of Western Europe. In the Pacific, there are three things you really need to know. In June of 1942, the United States defeats the Japanese Navy. The United States has cracked the Japanese code. They know that the Japanese Navy is heading towards Midway, and they're hoping to take over Hawaii as well. The U.S. ambushes the Japanese Navy at Midway and scores a big victory. This is a turning point in the Pacific. Iwo Jima and Okinawa are small islands that are off the coast of Japan. And these islands were important because they took the war closer and closer to Japan. They were also important because they gave us air bases from which we could attack Japan with planes. They're also important because on both of these islands the Japanese fiercely resisted. Hiroshima and Nagasaki are cities in southern Japan that we used the atomic bomb against. You need to know three military units. You need to know the Tuskegee Airmen, the Nasai Regiment, and the Navajo Code Talkers. The Tuskegee Airmen are an African-American group of pilots who fought during World War II. Remember that during World War II, the American military was segregated. The Nasai Regiment was a Japanese-American regiment that fought in Europe in World War II. They are famous because they are the most highly decorated World War II unit. Actually, they're the most highly decorated military unit in American history. The Navajo Code Talkers were Native Americans, Navajos obviously, who used coded messages to help with the marine invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. World War II saw some brutal treatment of soldiers and civilians. We first look at soldiers. The Geneva Convention was a series of treaties that world countries had signed, including the United States, including Japan. These treaties basically spelled out rules for how you should treat captured soldiers. At the beginning of World War II, the Japanese attacked and took over the Philippines. And the biggest island of the Philippines, a place called Luzon, there the Japanese took thousands and thousands of Americans prisoners and marched them without food and without water for 13 days. And it was horrific treatment by the Japanese. Over 10,000 US soldiers died. And when we talk about the Pacific, the war in the Pacific, the war there was not like the war in Europe. The war in the Pacific was on islands, it was often fought in jungles, and the war in the Pacific was vicious and a lot more savage than the war in Europe. Not that war is ever nice and not savage, but in the Pacific it was particularly savage because of the environment and the jungle environment and the tropical environment. In Europe, of course, we focus on the Holocaust. And you need to know a few terms. Genocide means the systematic and purposeful destruction of a racial group or an ethnic group. The Holocaust is the German word for their final solution. During World War II, the Germans formalized a policy to eliminate Jewish people in Central Europe. You can see on the map different concentration camps and different extermination camps where people were killed. A lot of these extermination camps were in modern-day Poland. You can see the graphic shows you Jewish losses. Obviously 6 million Jewish people died in the Holocaust, but there were other affected groups too. 3 million other people died, including Polish people, Eastern European people, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. Okay, Toby. At home, the World War II had a surprisingly positive impact. World War II is going to end the Depression. Everyone's going to have a job. Remember that the government awards contracts during World War II. They're called cost-plus contracts. This is where the government awarded big contracts, military contracts, to companies and gave them money to cover the cost and then gave them money to give them a profit. The US economy is going to boom because we have this wonderful automobile industry that we can just retool and start producing military stuff. And you can see in the two graphs, we're going to stop producing cars and we're going to start producing tanks. And the auto industry is going to produce a lot of other military material as well. And World War II offers opportunities for other people too, especially women and African Americans. Rosie the Riveter. And the map shows how people moved from place to place looking for work in World War II. and African Americans are going to be on the move again because they are able to get jobs in factories during World War II. The difference between World War II and World War I is that we have to ration items, because in World War I, if you remember, everything was voluntary. Certain days of the week you were encouraged not to eat meat, not to eat bread, that kind of thing. In World War II, it's not voluntary. You can only buy so much food, and other materials are in short supply. Citizens were encouraged to grow their own vegetables, and they were encouraged to participate in things like scrap drives, where old things like old bicycles or old car tires would be used and recycled by the government. World War II, we have a draft, the Selective Service Draft, and we also have propaganda like we did in World War I. In World War II, the government office designed with propaganda, producing propaganda, is the Office of War Information. The big difference between World War II and World War I is how we produce that propaganda. By World War II, we've had 20 years of movies, so Hollywood gets involved, and if you remember the cartoons we watched in class, there's one of them, De Fuhrer's Face, with Donald Duck. Other famous movie stars produced movies that were supposed to make fun of the enemy and get all Americans thinking the same way. Just like World War I, we're also going to have posters, and you can see the enemy is portrayed as evil. There's the Nazi, and in his monocle you can see they've hanged someone. The Japanese were portrayed in a very racist way. You can see the way that the Japanese guy is drawn. He doesn't look very human. And the way that Japanese people talked was made fun of. So Tokyo kids say, much waste of material makes soul happy. And obviously that poster is designed to be kind of racist, but it's kind to be funny at the time. And here's another propaganda poster. Is your troop necessary? This poster is encouraging people to go on, rather than drive their own cars and waste gasoline if they're going to do something, at least drive with other people, or really think to yourself, do you have to travel? Alright, that's it. Good luck on your test.